How did Louisiana's seafood boils conquer America? Was it the spices that first caught people's attention, or was it something deeper about gathering around a steaming pot? And when exactly did throwing shellfish into boiling water become less about survival and more about celebration? Picture yourself on Louisiana's coast 1,000 years ago. Nothing would look familiar, no cities, no recognizable landmarks. Yet archaeological evidence reveals something oddly comforting. Massive shell deposits called middens stretch along the Gulf Coast, some reaching 20 feet high. These aren't random trash heaps, but proof that somebody was hosting serious shellfish gatherings long before anyone wrote down a recipe. Over the next hour, we'll trace how an ancient coastal practice evolved through centuries of cultural collision, transforming into the newspaper-covered table phenomenon that now has Americans everywhere dumping seasoned seafood onto their patios. As this aromatic story unfolds, your thoughts might naturally begin to soften, matching the gentle rhythm of historical tides while the edges of your day blur like salt crystals dissolving in warm water. Consider subscribing if culinary history appeals to your curious mind. Perhaps mention in the comments what seafood traditions your own region holds dear, or simply share what corner of the world you're listening from tonight. Now might be perfect for adjusting your environment, dimming that screen just a touch, letting gravity pull tension from your shoulders as we wade into these historical waters. Archaeological evidence proves indigenous peoples gathered and cooked shellfish along the Gulf Coast for at least 2 millennia before Europeans arrived. The chitimachas, hummus, and attacapus left behind shell middens at sites like Chifuncti, layers of oyster, clam, and crab shells mixed with charcoal and broken pottery. While we can't know their exact cooking methods, burn marks on shells suggest communal feasting was already central to coastal life. Based on seasonal accumulation patterns, archaeologists believe these were scheduled events, timed to specific moons and spawning seasons. The most intriguing debate among archaeologists centers on whether these groups practice stone boiling. Some scholars point to fire-cracked rocks found near shell deposits, proposing that indigenous peoples heated stones and dropped them into hide-lined pits filled with water and shellfish. Others argue the evidence remains too fragmentary, that we're projecting New England clam-bake techniques onto incomplete Gulf Coast data. The presence of those cracked stones keeps the question alive in academic circles. What seasonings did they use? The archaeological record stays silent, but wild sassafras grew abundantly near middens, the same leaves that would later become fill powder. Peppergrass, wild onions, and coastal bay laurels all thrived in these areas. These plants leave no archaeological trace when thrown into cooking vessels, but their consistent presence near gathering sites suggests intentional cultivation. The Attakapas people had perhaps the most notorious reputation. Their name literally means eater of humans in Choctaw, though historians now believe this was propaganda from rival tribes. French explorer Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville wrote in 1699 about encountering a Attakapas having what he called a feast of the sea, families gathered around beach fires, throwing crabs and fish into ceramic vessels, adding plants that made the air smell, both sweet and sharp. Here's something rarely discussed: indigenous preservation techniques. Archaeological sites reveal smoking racks, sun-drying platforms, even traces of crab meat packed in rendered bear fat. This wasn't subsistence survival, but a complex food system based on intimate knowledge of tides and lunar cycles. They knew which beaches had the fattest oysters in October, where blue crabs gathered to molt in May. Spanish documents from 1778 mention coastal natives teaching colonists crucial safety knowledge we still follow, warning that oysters could be dangerous in months without an R, showing them how to purge crawfish before cooking. This practical wisdom, passed from indigenous peoples to European colonists, would become the foundation of Louisiana seafood traditions. I find myself wondering about the last great indigenous seafood gathering before European diseases shattered these communities. Did anyone present sense it was an ending? Or did they assume, as we all do, that traditions stretch forward forever? The Homa people maintain oral traditions about seafood gatherings going back to the beginning. Elders interviewed in the 1970s described ancestral techniques, digging pits near high tide lines, lining them with wet palmetto fronds, layering in shellfish, covering everything with Spanish moss and sand before building fires on top. The slow steam would cook everything perfectly, shells falling away from tender meat. But the historical record gets quiet here. European diseases decimated coastal populations. Some communities lost 90% of their people within a generation. Detailed cooking knowledge vanished with them. What survived was fragmentary, filtered through European observers who didn't always understand what they were witnessing. Yet physical evidence speaks clearly. Those shell middens weren't just disposal sites, but deliberately organized spaces. Some contain decorated pottery, carved tools showing where from opening thousands of shells, gaming pieces suggesting people played while waiting for food to cook. For thousands of years, Gulf Coast indigenous peoples had developed cultures centered around communal shellfish gathering. They had techniques we'll never fully recover, seasonings we can only guess at, social traditions that would echo forward. As you picture those ancient fires burning along the coast, shells cracking in heat, steam rising into unmarked skies, you're witnessing the very first chapter of a much longer story. The pot was already boiling, waiting for new ingredients, new cultures to add their flavors to the mix. And soon enough, ships would appear on that horizon, carrying people who would bring entirely different ideas about how to cook what the sea provides. The year 1755 changed everything, though nobody standing on Louisiana's shores could have predicted it. Thousands of French-speaking Acadians were being forced from their homes in what's now Nova Scotia, scattered to the winds by British soldiers who burned their farms and separated their families. This event, known as Le Grand Drangement, would eventually deliver to Louisiana's bayous a people who understood one thing above all else: how to make the most of what the water provides. Between 1764 and 1785, These refugees began arriving in waves, exhausted, often penniless, carrying little beyond memories of maritime life in Canada's cold Atlantic waters. The Spanish governors of Louisiana, eager to populate their colony with Catholic settlers who might resist British expansion, welcomed them with land grants along the bayous west of New Orleans. Places with names like Lafourche, Teche, Vermilion. These waterways would become the arteries of a new culture. What the Acadians found in Louisiana must have seemed like another planet. Instead of the North Atlantic's cod and lobster, they encountered alligators, crawfish, and blue crabs. The water itself was different, brackish where their Canadian bays had been salty, warm where theirs had been cold enough to kill. They had to learn which local fish were safe, which swamp plants were edible, how to read completely unfamiliar tides and seasons. The archaeological record from early Acadian settlements shows a fascinating adaptation process. Excavations at sites along Bayou Lafourche reveal French-style pottery shards mixed with locally made ceramics, iron pot fragments that suggest they quickly adopted Indigenous and Creole cooking methods. Some scholars argue, though evidence remains limited, that the Acadians' communal work traditions from Canada, where families would gather for barn raisings and harvest celebrations, naturally evolved into communal cooking events in Louisiana. Here's where the story gets interesting and contentious among historians. The Acadians didn't just adapt to Louisiana, they absorbed techniques from everyone around them. Spanish colonists showed them how to use peppers and tomatoes, crops unknown in Canada. German settlers along the river shared their sausage-making knowledge. Most significantly, enslaved Africans and free people of color taught them about okra, rice cultivation, and the 100 ways to use every part of an animal. The transformation from Acadian to Cajun wasn't instant. It took generations. Church records from the 1770s and 1780s show Acadian communities initially keeping to themselves, marrying within their own groups, maintaining French traditions. But by the early 1800s, marriage records show increasing unions with Spanish, German, and Caribbean families. Each marriage brought new recipes, new techniques, new flavors into the cultural mix. Consider the humble crawfish, those freshwater lobsters that Acadians initially viewed with suspicion. In Canada, they'd harvested massive Atlantic lobsters, prestigious catches worth good money. Crawfish were so small, so muddy, so much work for so little meat. Local folklore claims, though it's probably too neat to be entirely true, that Acadians first called them crevisses with disdain, saying they were sad little lobsters that followed us from Nova Scotia and shrank along the way. But necessity breeds innovation. The Acadians noticed enslaved people and Native Americans catching crawfish in the swamps, using them in stews and soups. Spanish colonists mentioned that crawfish reminded them of river crayfish from Spain, perfectly edible when properly cleaned. By the 1790s, Acadian families were setting simple traps, willow branches woven into cones, baited with chicken necks or fish heads. The first documented mention of Acadians cooking crawfish in large quantities comes from a Spanish administrator's report in 1792, describing a spring gathering where multiple families pooled their catches for what he called a considerable feast. He noted they cooked the crawfish in iron pots with quantities of pepper and aromatic herbs, though he didn't specify which ones. This might be the earliest written reference to what would evolve into the crawfish boil, though it probably looked nothing like modern versions. What made Acadian cooking distinctive was their use of the frigate, a cooking method from maritime Canada where everything went into one pot. This wasn't just convenience, it was cultural. In the harsh Canadian winters, maintaining one fire and one pot made sense. In Louisiana's humidity, it still made sense, but for different reasons. Less heat in the house, fewer dishes to clean, more time for visiting while food slowly cooked. The Acadians also brought their tradition of butcheries, communal butchering events where families would share a cow or pig, each taking turns providing the animal. No single family could eat a whole cow before it spoiled in Louisiana's heat, but divided among 8 families, nothing went to waste. This cooperative approach would later extend to seafood when shrimping and crabbing became commercial enterprises. I've always found it poignant that the Acadians, a people literally torn from their homes, would become so deeply rooted in Louisiana's wetlands that we now can't imagine the state without them. They turned exile into belonging, loss into reinvention. Language played a crucial role in this transformation. The Acadians spoke a 17th century French that was already different from Parisian French. In Louisiana, it mixed with Spanish, various African languages, and indigenous words. Food terms especially showed this blend. Couch came from African languages, bayou from Choctaw, lagniappe from Spanish via Quechua. When Acadians said they were making sauce picante, the sauce part was French, but the peppers were purely New World. By 1803, when Louisiana became American territory, the Acadians had been in Louisiana for roughly 40 years. 2 generations had been born on the bayous. They were no longer French, no longer quite Acadian. They were becoming something new. The Americans called them Cajuns, a corruption of Acadians, and though it was meant dismissively, the name stuck. The isolation of bayou communities, accessible only by boat until well into the 20th century, allowed Cajun culture to develop its own distinct characteristics. Each bayou developed slightly different traditions, different spice preferences, different cooking methods. What remained consistent was the communal nature of food preparation, the emphasis on using everything available, and the gradual incorporation of seafood as a central element rather than a supplement. As we move toward the 19th century, these Acadian-turned-Cajun communities were about to discover that the muddy creatures they'd learned to trap and cook would become more than just survival food. But that transformation, from necessity to delicacy, would take another century and circumstances nobody could have foreseen. The 1800s began with crawfish still firmly in the category of poor man's food across Louisiana. Tax records from 1810 New Orleans list beef, pork, and chicken as taxable goods, but crawfish appear nowhere in official documents. They had no commercial value, couldn't be preserved for shipping, and most city dwellers considered them fit only for enslaved people and the desperately poor. Yet within these marginalized communities, something remarkable was developing. Enslaved Africans had been perfecting their use of crawfish since the 1700s. Plantation records, when they mention slave rations at all, show meager allotments of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses. But archaeological digs at slave quarter sites reveal thousands of crawfish remains, evidence that enslaved people supplemented their rations by trapping in nearby swamps and streams. They developed ingenious traps from whatever materials they could find. Spanish moss woven into nets, broken baskets repurposed as cages, even hollow gourds with holes cut just large enough for crawfish to enter but not escape. West African cooking traditions merged with local ingredients in ways that would fundamentally shape Louisiana cuisine. Many enslaved people came from regions where communal eating from shared bowls was standard, where one-pot meals stretched ingredients to feed extended families, where spices weren't just flavoring but medicine and preservation. They applied these principles to crawfish, boiling them with wild garlic, sassafras, and hot peppers grown in small garden plots. The Code Noir. Louisiana's brutal slave laws ironically contained provisions that would influence seafood traditions. It required slaveholders to give enslaved people Sundays off and small plots for personal gardens. On these precious free days, enslaved communities would gather for communal meals, pooling whatever they'd grown, trapped, or traded. These Sunday gatherings, born from oppression but sustained by resilience, established patterns of communal seafood cooking that would outlast slavery itself. Here's where historians encounter a frustrating gap. We know enslaved people were eating crawfish regularly. We can see the archaeological evidence. But written recipes? Detailed cooking methods? These were deliberately kept from enslaved people who were forbidden literacy. What survived came through oral tradition, transmitted after emancipation when formerly enslaved people could finally tell their own stories. Free people of color in New Orleans occupied a unique position in this culinary evolution. Unlike enslaved people, they could own property, run businesses, and document their lives. The estate inventory of Marie Lavendier, a free woman of color who died in 1823, lists 2 large iron pots for cooking crawfish among her possessions. This suggests crawfish preparation was already specialized enough to require dedicated equipment. Native Americans never stopped eating crawfish throughout this period. The Homa and Chitimacha tribes, pushed to marginal lands by European settlement, relied even more heavily on traditional foods. They taught both enslaved Africans and poor white settlers advanced trapping techniques, how to read the seasons, where crawfish migrated during droughts, which baits worked best in different waters. This knowledge exchange happened quietly, away from official notice, but its impact was profound. The scholarly debate about when crawfish shifted from subsistence to celebration food has no clear answer. Some historians point to an 1834 newspaper advertisement for a New Orleans FT champ tray that mentions crevices among other delicacies. Others argue this was exceptional, that crawfish remained primarily poverty food until after the Civil War. What seems clear is that different communities assign different meanings to the same creature. Poor white settlers, especially those in isolated bayou communities, began adopting crawfish as survival food during the 1830s and 1840s. Unlike their wealthier neighbors who could afford beef and pork, these families lived much like their enslaved and Native American neighbors, trapping, fishing, and gathering what they could. They learned by watching and imitating, gradually incorporating crawfish into their own developing traditions. The German coast settlers along the Mississippi River took a different approach. These methodical farmers, who'd arrived in the 1720s, initially ignored crawfish entirely. But by the 1840s, facing economic hardship and crop failures, they began experimenting. A diary entry from Hans Müller, dated 1847, describes cooking crawfish with sauerkraut and mustard seeds. An unusual combination, but surprisingly palatable. This Germanic influence would later appear in certain Louisiana crawfish preparations that include mustard-based seasonings. Catholic feast days provided acceptable occasions for crawfish consumption across class lines. During Lent, when meat was forbidden, even wealthy Catholics sought alternatives. Church records from the 1850s mention crawfish being served at parish gatherings, though usually transformed into bisques or toufs that disguise their humble origins. The idea that God's dietary restrictions could make crawfish acceptable to the upper classes contains its own special irony. I sometimes wonder what enslaved cooks thought as they prepared elaborate crawfish bisques for plantation owners. The same creatures they'd been eating for survival transformed into refined French cuisine simply by adding cream and sherry. The most detailed early description of communal crawfish cooking comes from an unexpected source, a Union Army officer's letter home in 1863. Captain James Patterson, stationed near Thibodaux, wrote to his wife about witnessing formerly enslaved people celebrating their freedom with what he called a peculiar feast. He described large washpots over fires, crawfish boiled with vegetation I could not identify, and corn, people eating with their hands from communal piles spread on boards. They seemed to consider it quite a celebration, he wrote with obvious puzzlement. Children played a crucial but overlooked role in crawfish's culinary evolution. In poor communities, both black and white, children were the primary crawfish catchers. Too young for field work but old enough to wade in shallow water, they'd spend hours setting and checking traps. This wasn't seen as leisure, but as their contribution to family survival. The techniques they developed through play and repetition became the foundation for later commercial harvesting. By the 1870s, as Reconstruction temporarily opened new possibilities for formerly enslaved people, small mentions of crawfish appear in Black newspapers and church cookbooks. The Christian Women's Association of Baton Rouge published a cookbook in 1876 that includes a recipe for a crawfish stew that calls for onions, peppers, and tomatoes, essentially the Louisiana Trinity that would become standard. But it still carefully notes this is an economical dish for large gatherings. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible. Each generation made crawfish a little less shameful, a little more acceptable. What started as absolute necessity slowly acquired the patina of tradition. The seasonings grew more complex, the cooking methods more refined, the gatherings more celebratory. By century's end, what had been survival food for the enslaved and desperate was beginning its slow transformation into something else entirely. The years between 1880 and 1930 witnessed a revolution in Louisiana's relationship with seafood, though it happened so gradually that few people noticed it at the time. Ice-making technology arrived first in New Orleans around 1868, but it wasn't until the 1880s that ice became cheap enough to transform the fishing industry. Suddenly, shrimp and crabs could survive the journey from coast to market, opening possibilities that would reshape both commerce and culture. Before mechanical refrigeration, Louisiana's coastal bounty was essentially trapped within a day's travel of the water. Shrimp had to be dried or pickled, crabs couldn't travel at all, and most inland communities never tasted fresh seafood. The arrival of the Morgan City Ice and Fuel Company in 1882, followed by similar operations across the coast, changed everything. Fishermen could now pack their catches in ice cars on the Southern Pacific Railroad, reaching markets as far as Houston and Memphis. The Dunbar Lopez Company, founded by Croatian immigrants in 1886, pioneered the use of lugger boats with built-in ice holds. These shallow draft vessels could navigate both the Gulf and the bayous, bringing unprecedented quantities of fresh shrimp to processing facilities. By 1900, Louisiana was shipping over 2 million pounds of iced shrimp annually, though nobody was yet thinking about boiling them in massive quantities for communal feasts. What really transformed coastal Louisiana was the platform system, a method possibly borrowed from Dalmatian fishing traditions, but adapted to local conditions. Fishermen would build camps on stilts over the water, living there for weeks during shrimping season. Multiple families would share these platforms, pooling labor, splitting costs, and inevitably, cooking together. A 1904 photograph from the Terrebonne Parish Archives shows 15 people on a single platform, with what appears to be a large pot suspended over a fire built on a metal plate. The scholarly argument about when outdoor seafood boiling became standard practice often overlooks these fishing platforms. Some historians focus on agricultural communities, missing the obvious fact that people literally living above the water would naturally develop methods for cooking their abundant catches. Platform communities had access to unlimited seafood, shared cooking facilities, and practical reasons to prepare large quantities at once. Here's something most food historians miss: the role of the Catholic Church in popularizing communal seafood meals. As Croatian, Italian, and Irish fishermen established communities along the coast, they brought their tradition of church feast days. St. Joseph's Day, St. Peter's Day, the Blessing of the Fleet, each provided an occasion for massive outdoor cooking. Church records from Our Lady of Good Harbor in Burris mention purchasing 3 washing kettles for the preparation of crabs in 1909. The technological leap that nobody talks about was the butane burner. While most histories focus on boats and ice, the ability to create intense, controllable heat outdoors was revolutionary. The first commercial butane operations in Louisiana began around 1912, initially serving the petroleum industry. But resourceful fishermen quickly realized these burners could heat large pots of water faster than wood fires, without the smoke and ash that flavored everything cooked over them. Commercial canning operations inadvertently influenced home cooking methods. The Dunbar Ducate Company required workers to briefly boil shrimp before peeling, using massive vats of salted water. Workers noticed that these partially cooked shrimp tasted remarkably good, especially when slightly overcooked by accident with extra salt. They began replicating the process at home, though with considerably more attention to seasoning. The Vietnamese wouldn't arrive in large numbers until the 1970s, but Chinese immigrants were already influencing Gulf Coast seafood by 1900. They introduced the concept of dried shrimp as a seasoning agent, something that would later appear in many boiling liquid recipes. They also brought different net designs that could catch smaller shrimp, varieties that locals had previously ignored, but which turned out to be sweeter and more tender when boiled. Platform camps developed their own microcultures and cooking styles. The Grand Ole camps favored simple salt and bay leaves, while Lafitte fishermen added onions and lemons to their boiling water. These differences weren't arbitrary. They reflected what grew wild near each camp, what ethnicities dominated each platform, and what fish scraps were available for flavoring the water. Competition between camps led to innovation, each group guarding their secret additions while trying to spy on their neighbors' pots. The 1927 Mississippi River flood devastated Louisiana, but created an unexpected culinary development. Thousands of refugees crowded into tent cities, where mass feeding became necessary. Red Cross records describe crayfish boils being organized to feed flood victims, using donated crawfish and whatever seasonings were available. For many urban refugees, this was their first experience with communal seafood boiling, and they carried the memory back to New Orleans and Baton Rouge. I find it fascinating that natural disaster and industrial progress converged to spread a cooking tradition, as if history itself conspired to democratize the seafood boil. Women's roles in this evolution deserve more recognition. While men dominated commercial fishing, women controlled platform kitchens and church feast preparations. They decided what went into the pot, how long it cooked, and who got served first. The Ladies' Auxiliary of St. Bernard Parish published a fundraising cookbook in 1928 that includes 7 different recipes for boiled seafood feeds, each credited to a different woman, each slightly different in technique. Labor disputes inadvertently spread boiling traditions. The 1929 shrimpers' strike brought together fishermen from different ethnic communities: Filipinos, Mexicans, Croatians, Cajuns, who spent weeks in shared camps. They cooked together out of necessity, sharing techniques and ingredients. Union records mention communal meals prepared in washbots as part of strike logistics, though they probably didn't realize they were documenting culinary history. By 1930, all the elements were in place. Abundant cheap seafood thanks to improved boats and refrigeration. Large immigrant communities with communal cooking traditions. Available technology for outdoor cooking, and economic pressures that made pooling resources sensible. The Great Depression was about to begin, and with it, a period when sharing food wouldn't just be cultural tradition, but economic survival. The stage was set, though nobody could have predicted that economic catastrophe would transform a practical cooking method into something approaching sacrament. The Great Depression descended on Louisiana like a slow-moving hurricane, stripping away luxuries first, then necessities, until communities had nothing left but each other. By 1932, unemployment in New Orleans reached 30%. Sugar plantations closed across the state, and fishing boats sat idle because nobody could afford fuel. Yet, paradoxically, this period of desperate scarcity would cement the seafood boil as a cornerstone of Louisiana culture. What saved countless families from starvation was free food that nobody owned. Crawfish in the ditches, crabs in the marshes, shrimp in the tidal pools. These creatures required no investment beyond time and effort, no seed money, no land ownership, no equipment beyond simple traps made from scrap materials. Federal Writers Project interviews from 1936 repeatedly mention families surviving on mudbug suppers and poor man's gatherings where seafood was the only protein available. The communal aspect wasn't just tradition anymore, it was survival strategy. A family might catch 20 pounds of crawfish but have no seasonings. Another might have peppers from their garden, but no protein. A third might contribute onions or salt carefully hoarded from better times. Pool these resources together, and suddenly you had a meal worth eating. Church parishes organized share suppers where admission was whatever you could contribute: a handful of bay leaves, a cup of rice, or a sack of crawfish. Here's what most Depression-era histories overlook. The WPA actually funded seafood processing facilities as part of their infrastructure projects. The Delacroix Island facility, built in 1935, included massive outdoor cooking areas specifically designed for community use. The official purpose was teaching proper seafood preparation for commercial purposes, but locals immediately recognized these as perfect venues for communal boils. Government money had inadvertently subsidized a cultural tradition. The scholarly debate about whether the Depression created or merely expanded communal seafood boiling misses the point entirely. What matters is that economic catastrophe transformed an occasional practice into a weekly necessity for thousands of families. Some historians argue the tradition would have developed anyway. Others insist poverty was the crucial catalyst. The evidence suggests both are partially right. Tradition provided the template, but desperation made it indispensable. Rural communities developed intricate sharing systems that anthropologists would later call gift economies. The Thibodaux area had crawfish circles where families took turns hosting boils, each providing the location and fuel while others brought catches and seasonings. Nobody kept exact accounts, but everyone remembered who contributed and who didn't. These informal networks provided social insurance. If your traps came up empty, you still ate, knowing you'd reciprocate when fortune improved. A peculiar innovation emerged from scarcity, the practice of boiling everything together. Before the Depression, different seafoods were typically cooked separately, shrimp in one pot, crabs in another, crawfish in a third. But fuel was precious, pots were scarce, and time was better spent catching more food than tending multiple fires. The everything pot was born from necessity, though it would later be celebrated as a deliberate culinary choice. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration distributed surplus commodities that unexpectedly influenced seafood boil flavors. Massive quantities of onions from Texas, potatoes from Idaho, corn from Iowa, all distributed free to relief recipients. Louisianans threw these into their seafood pots partly for bulk, partly because anything free was precious, but discovered these additions actually improved both flavor and substance. What started as making do became standard practice. I sometimes wonder if abundance would have killed the communal boil, if prosperity might have sent everyone back to their private kitchens, but poverty welded the tradition so deeply into community consciousness that it survived even when the need passed. Women's roles during the Depression deserve special recognition. While men trapped and fished, women orchestrated the complex logistics of communal cooking. They decided portions, managed contributions, and most importantly, ensured children and elderly ate first. The Breaux Bridge Ladies' Aid Society kept meticulous records, showing they organized over 200 community feeds between 1933 and 1939, feeding an average of 80 people per event. Black communities faced double hardship, economic catastrophe plus Jim Crow restrictions. They couldn't use many public facilities, couldn't access some relief programs, yet they maintained their own parallel tradition of communal seafood cooking. The Zion Travelers Baptist Church in Plaquemines Parish has records of fellowship feeds throughout the 1930s, carefully noting they served whosoever was hungry, regardless of ability to contribute. children of the Depression grew up thinking communal seafood boils were simply how people ate. They didn't know it was unusual, didn't realize other states didn't gather weekly around steaming pots, didn't understand their parents had turned catastrophe into culture. Oral histories collected in the 1970s consistently mention these gatherings as the happiest memories from otherwise grim childhoods. The end of Prohibition in 1933 added another element: beer. Breweries desperately needed customers, bars needed attractions, and communal seafood boils provided perfect opportunities for both. Falstaff Brewery sponsored fishermen's feeds at bars across southern Louisiana, providing free beer if patrons brought their own seafood. These events blurred the line between private gatherings and public celebrations, extending the tradition beyond family and church circles. Medical authorities of the era inadvertently promoted seafood consumption. The Louisiana Board of Health's 1935 bulletin praised seafood as complete nutrition available without cost, recommending it especially for children and pregnant women. They didn't mention taste or tradition, just survival, but their endorsement gave official permission to what people were already doing from necessity. By decade's end, what had begun as emergency response had evolved into anticipated ritual. The Houma Courier's social column from 1939 lists 17 different crawfish boils in a single weekend, describing them not as hardship meals, but as gay gatherings and festive occasions. The transformation was complete. Poverty food had become party food, though the communal ethic born from shared struggle would endure. As the 1930s ended and war clouds gathered, Louisiana's seafood boil tradition stood at a crossroads. It had survived, even thrived, through economic disaster. But young men were about to leave for foreign shores, taking their memories of communal pots with them and perhaps bringing something back that would change everything once again. World War II scattered Louisiana boys across the globe, from Pacific Islands to European villages, and wherever they went, they talked about food from home. Letters in the National World War II Museum archives reveal a constant theme: soldiers describing crawfish boils to bewildered comrades from Iowa and Oregon, trying to explain why anyone would eat mud bugs and how dumping everything on newspaper made sense. These homesick explanations would prove more influential than anyone imagined. Military bases across Louisiana became unexpected laboratories for culinary fusion. Camp Polk, Camp Claiborne, Camp Livingston each hosted tens of thousands of troops from every state. Local communities organized weekend seafood feeds for soldiers, partly as patriotic duty, partly as business opportunity. The Leesville Leader reported in 1943 that local churches served over 5,000 pounds of boiled crawfish to troops in a single spring weekend, introducing the tradition to young men who'd never seen a crawfish before. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that most historians miss entirely: the reverse influence. Soldiers from other regions brought their own spice preferences to Louisiana. Texas troops introduced jalapeos. New Mexico soldiers brought different chili varieties. Memphis boys suggested dry rubs. The seafood boil became a two-way cultural exchange, not just Louisiana exporting its traditions, but absorbing new influences that would permanently alter the flavor profile. The wartime shortage of black pepper nearly killed the tradition before it could spread. Pepper was rationed, imported spices vanished, and Louisiana cooks had to improvise. They turned to native plants with more intensity: wild sassafras, native mint, pepper grass, and most importantly, cayenne peppers that grew easily in victory gardens. This forced substitution permanently shifted the flavor profile from black pepper dominant to the cayenne-forward heat we now consider standard. Some scholars argue that wartime rationing democratized the seafood boil by making expensive ingredients unavailable to everyone, but evidence suggests the opposite. Seafood wasn't rationed. It was actually promoted as a patriotic alternative to rationed meats. The U.S. Office of Price Administration's 1943 bulletin explicitly encouraged seafood consumption, calling it the fighting food that needs no ration points. Suddenly, eating crawfish was supporting the war effort. The real transformation happened in military mess halls. Louisiana cooks drafted into kitchen duty couldn't help themselves. They organized crawfish boils using military equipment. A photograph from Fort Polk's archives shows soldiers around a massive pot balanced on a field kitchen burner, dated May 1944, labeled simply Louisiana Night. These events required official approval, meaning the U.S. Army inadvertently sanctioned and spread the tradition. Veterans returning from the Pacific may have brought something controversial. Some oral histories suggest they encountered MSG in occupied territories and recognized its flavor-enhancing properties. While impossible to verify definitively, by the late 1940s, certain Louisiana cooks reportedly kept hidden stashes of what they called flavor powder or secret salt, though whether this was MSG or simply salt mixed with dried herbs remains debatable among food historians. The GI Bill created another unexpected pathway for tradition spreading. Veterans used their education benefits to attend colleges across America, bringing their food traditions with them. LSU students from small bayou towns found themselves at universities in California and Michigan, organizing dormitory crawfish boils with ship seafood and makeshift equipment. These events were curiosities at first, cultural exhibitions, but they planted seeds that would germinate decades later. I find it remarkable that global conflict could transform a regional tradition into a nationwide phenomenon, as if war's disruption paradoxically created deeper connections. Women's wartime roles fundamentally changed the boiling tradition. With men overseas, women ran the fishing boats, the processing plants, and the community feeds. They made executive decisions about recipes and techniques that had previously been male-dominated domains. The Ladies' Auxiliary of American Legion Post 38 in Homa documented that women-run boils during the war years introduced corn and potatoes as standard additions, vegetables that filled people up when seafood was scarce. Black soldiers faced segregation even in their home state, but seafood boils became rare spaces of relative integration. Not officially, not publicly, but memoir accounts suggest that behind camps and in wooded areas, integrated gatherings happened. Corporal James Baptiste's memoir, published in 1987, describes midnight gatherings where color didn't matter when you were peeling crawfish in the dark, though he acknowledges these were dangerous exceptions, not the rule. The Philippines connection deserves more attention. Louisiana soldiers stationed their discovered similarities between Filipino seafood preparations and their own traditions. Both cultures valued communal eating, both used whatever seafood was available, both appreciated intense flavors. Veterans brought back Filipino techniques like using beer in the boiling liquid and adding citrus for brightness, innovations that seemed foreign but gradually gained acceptance in certain communities. Post-war prosperity should have ended communal boiling. Families could afford individual meals. Restaurants were booming, and modern conveniences made home cooking easier. Yet the opposite happened. Veterans organizations made seafood boils central to their social calendars. VFW posts and American Legion halls across Louisiana institutionalized what had been informal gatherings. The tradition had survived poverty. Now it would be preserved by prosperity. The late 1940s saw the first commercial crawfish farms, ventures started by veterans using GI loans. Before this, all crawfish were wild-caught, supplies were unpredictable, and large-scale boils required extensive planning. Farm-raised crawfish changed everything. You could schedule a boil, guarantee supply, and maintain consistent quality. What had been seasonal and opportunistic became year-round and reliable. By 1950, something fundamental had shifted. The seafood boil was no longer just a Louisiana thing. It was beginning its transformation into an American phenomenon. Veterans had spread the gospel, wartime innovations had improved the recipe, and commercial availability made it practical. The stage was set for explosive growth, though it would take new infrastructure and changing demographics to truly spread the tradition beyond the South. The irony wasn't lost on older Louisianans. Their poverty food, their survival technique, their marker of hardship, was becoming a celebration. Young people who'd never known real hunger were gathering around pots just like their grandparents had, but for entirely different reasons. The form remained, the meaning had transformed, and somehow that felt like both loss and victory. The 1970s brought an unlikely catalyst for Louisiana's seafood boil expansion, the completion of Interstate 10 through the state. That ribbon of concrete, finished in 1973, connected Lake Charles to New Orleans to the Florida Panhandle in ways the old highways never could. Weekend trips that once took all day now took hours, and curious travelers began discovering roadside seafood shacks that locals had kept to themselves for generations. Gas station owners along I-10 noticed something peculiar. Out-of-state cars would stop for fuel and leave with ice chests full of live crawfish. The Bro Bridge Texaco, according to its former owner, sold more crawfish than gasoline during spring weekends in 1975. These weren't commercial operations, just locals with surplus catches making pocket money, but they were inadvertently creating seafood ambassadors who would return home with tales of massive pots and newspaper-covered tables. The other major highway development, often overlooked in food histories, was Interstate 49 connecting Lafayette to Shreveport. Suddenly, North Louisiana, culturally more aligned with Arkansas and Texas than the Cajun South, had direct access to coastal traditions. Church groups from Shreveport began organizing bus trips to attend authentic crawfish boils, treating them like cultural expeditions to a foreign land within their own state. Tourism boards recognized the opportunity before restaurants did. The Lafayette Parish Convention and Visitors Commission launched their Cajun Country campaign in 1974, explicitly promoting crawfish boils as tourist attractions. They published pamphlets explaining boiling techniques, distributed them at interstate rest stops, and essentially taught America that this was something worth traveling to experience. The campaign worked perhaps too well. Locals complained about outsiders driving up crawfish prices. The scholarly consensus credits television for spreading Cajun culture nationally, but evidence suggests the interstate system was equally important. You could watch Justin Wilson on PBS, but you couldn't taste crawfish through your TV screen. The highways made pilgrimage possible, turned viewers into participants, transformed curiosity into experience. Some food historians argue the interstates did more for regional cuisine exchange than any media could accomplish. Here's what nobody talks about: the CB radio culture of the 1970s. Truckers became unintentional food critics, broadcasting locations of good seafood boils across their networks. The handle Mudbug Mike became legendary for his detailed directions to obscure boiling spots, complete with reviews of spice levels and portion sizes. These analog social networks spread information faster than any tourism board could manage. Vietnamese refugees arriving after 1975 found themselves settling along the Siem 10 corridor, not by coincidence, but because that's where sponsors and Catholic charities had connections. They brought their own seafood traditions, their own communal cooking methods, their own spice preferences. Within 5 years, Vietnamese-run seafood markets along Highway 90 were selling lemongrass and fish sauce alongside traditional Cajun seasonings, creating fusion before fusion was fashionable. The oil boom of the late 1970s brought another wave of cultural exchange. Workers from Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas flooded into Louisiana's offshore industry, living in group housing, working rotating shifts, and eating together by necessity. Platform cooks, many of them Vietnamese or Cajun, had captive audiences for their seafood boils. These roughnecks would return home during their off weeks, attempting to recreate what they'd eaten offshore, usually badly but enthusiastically. Mobile home manufacturers inadvertently influenced the tradition by making outdoor cooking equipment standard. The 1970s models popular in Louisiana came with propane connections specifically designed for outdoor burners, marketed as hurricane preparation features, but really intended for crawfish pots. This standardization meant anyone buying a trailer home was essentially equipped for hosting a boil, whether they'd planned to or not. The Crawfish Festival in Breaux Bridge, established in 1959 but exploding in popularity during the 1970s, became a teaching laboratory. Visitors could watch demonstrations, ask questions, and most importantly, buy equipment. Vendors sold complete boiling kits to tourists, burners, pots, paddles, and pre-mixed seasonings, everything needed to attempt the tradition at home. Festival records show they shipped equipment to 43 states by 1979. Environmental changes also played a role. The terrible drought of 1977 concentrated crawfish in smaller areas, making them easier to catch, but also focusing attention on sustainable harvesting. The Louisiana Crawfish Farmers Association, formed that year, began promoting farm-raised crawfish as superior to wild-caught, more consistent, cleaner, available year-round. This agricultural shift would eventually make nationwide distribution feasible. I remember hearing old-timers complain that the interstate brought weekend warriors who didn't understand the culture, just wanted to take pictures and eat cheap crawfish. But those same complainers would sell them seasoning and give impromptu lessons, unable to resist sharing their knowledge. The connection between interstate travel and food tradition might seem mundane, but consider this. Every major crawfish boil hotspot outside Louisiana sits near an interstate exchange. Houston, Mobile, Pensacola, Jackson, all connected by I-10 or its tributaries. The highway system created a seafood corridor, a boiling belt that stretched from Texas to Florida. Small details mattered enormously. The standardization of cooler sizes to fit car trunks, the development of leak-proof bags for live crawfish, the proliferation of hotels with outdoor cooking areas, each innovation made it easier for the tradition to travel. The Coleman Company reported that Louisiana had the highest per capita sales of their 100-quart coolers, not for camping, but for transporting seafood. By decade's end, something subtle but significant had shifted. The seafood boil was no longer something you had to be born into. It was something you could learn, adopt, attempt. The highways had democratized access, tourism had commercialized the experience, and Vietnamese immigrants had proven the tradition could accommodate new influences while maintaining its essential character. The stage was being set for an explosion of interest, though it would take a World's Fair and celebrity chefs to truly launch Louisiana's seafood boil into the American mainstream. The 1984 Louisiana World Exposition opened on May 12th with a splash of Mississippi River water and the smell of boiling crawfish wafting across New Orleans. For 6 months, 7.3 million visitors would stream through the gates, many experiencing authentic Louisiana seafood for the first time. The fair's official food vendor list shows 23 different booths serving some variation of boiled seafood, from traditional crawfish to experimental combinations that would have horrified purists just a decade earlier. What made 1984 different from previous expositions was timing. Cable television had just exploded. USA Today had launched 2 years prior, and suddenly regional foods could become national news overnight. The exposition's press office, in a stroke of marketing genius, scheduled daily crawfish boil demonstrations at 2 p.m., perfectly timed for evening news broadcasts on the East Coast. Images of mountains of red crawfish being dumped onto checkered tablecloths became the visual shorthand for Louisiana cuisine. But here's the unexpected callback to our earlier story. Remember those Vietnamese refugees who'd settled along the Gulf Coast in the mid-1970s? By 1984, estimates suggest they controlled nearly 40% of Louisiana's commercial fishing industry. Many exposition vendors were buying seafood from Vietnamese suppliers, serving it with Vietnamese-influenced seasonings, creating a fusion that visitors assumed was traditionally Cajun. The authentic Louisiana experience tourists were consuming was actually less than a decade old. The exposition's most popular pavilion wasn't the Vatican exhibit or the NASA display, it was the Louisiana Folklife Village, where visitors could watch actual fishermen boiling seafood in massive pots. Pete Bergeron, a shrimper from Golden Meadow, was hired to demonstrate traditional techniques 8 hours a day. His oral history, recorded in 1999, describes teaching probably 10,000 people how to properly peel a crawfish, including food writers from the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and Los Angeles Times. The scholarly debate about the exposition's impact often misses a crucial detail. While academics argue about whether it commercialized or preserved Louisiana culture, they overlook the infrastructure it left behind. The exposition prompted New Orleans to upgrade its seafood processing facilities, install new health department regulations, and most importantly, establish reliable overnight shipping networks. Suddenly, live Louisiana crawfish could reach restaurants in Denver or Detroit within 24 hours. Major food corporations reportedly sent scouts to the exposition, taking notes on this communal eating phenomenon. According to corporate historians, internal memos from 1984 described crawfish boils as participatory dining experiences with significant market potential. Within 2 years, major companies had launched lines of Cajun-style seasonings, terrible approximations of the real thing, but they introduced the concept to grocery stores nationwide. The corporate colonization of crawfish culture had begun. The exposition's International Amphitheater hosted something unprecedented, a crawfish eating contest broadcast live on ESPN, then just 5 years old and desperate for content. The winner, a local named Jules Hebert, reportedly consumed 8 pounds in 15 minutes, but more importantly, 2 million Americans watched people eating crawfish on television. The spectacle normalized what had seemed exotic, made it entertainment rather than anthropology. Restaurant owners from across America attended the exposition specifically to learn about Louisiana cuisine. The National Restaurant Association's 1984 survey shows that Cajun/Creole was the most requested new cuisine type, jumping from barely registering in 1983 to third place by year's end. These weren't all high-end establishments. Red Lobster allegedly sent a team to study seafood boil service methods, though their sanitized version would bear little resemblance to authentic traditions. Here's what nobody discusses: the exposition's employee cafeteria. Over 3,000 workers, many from out of state, ate subsidized meals there daily. The cafeteria served boiled seafood every Friday, not as a special treat, but as the cheapest protein option. These workers, returning home to places like Ohio and Oregon, became unexpected evangelists. They might not have paid to try crawfish, but forced proximity made them converts. The Japanese pavilion staff became particularly enthusiastic about crawfish boils. Several Japanese newspapers ran features about this American kaiseki, comparing the communal aspects to traditional Japanese shared meals. This cross-cultural recognition helped legitimize crawfish boils among food intellectuals who might have dismissed them as mere folk practice. Sometimes it takes an outsider's perspective to recognize what locals take for granted. Transportation logistics created another lasting change. The exposition required massive quantities of fresh seafood delivered daily, forcing suppliers to develop systems that could handle volume while maintaining quality. Ice houses expanded, refrigerated truck fleets grew, and processing plants standardized their operations. This infrastructure would outlast the fair, making large-scale commercial distribution feasible for the first time. I sometimes think about the irony. An event meant to showcase Louisiana to the world ended up changing Louisiana itself, forcing it to codify traditions that had been informal, to standardize what had been variable, to explain what had been understood. The exposition's official cookbook, published by Times-Picayune, sold approximately 100,000 copies, spreading recipes nationwide. But more importantly, it included technical specifications, exact temperatures, precise timing, proper equipment descriptions. This wasn't just sharing recipes, it was creating a replicable system. Any competent cook with access to shipped seafood could now approximate a Louisiana seafood boil. Environmental protesters tried to disrupt several events, arguing that popularizing crawfish consumption would devastate wild populations. They were simultaneously right and wrong. Wild populations did face pressure, but the exposition also sparked massive investment in aquaculture. By 1985, crawfish farming had reportedly become a $100 million industry, ensuring supply could meet the demand the exposition had created. The final night of the exposition, November 11th, 1984, featured what was reported as the largest seafood boil in recorded history, approximately 20,000 pounds of crawfish, shrimp, and crabs served to 15,000 people. News footage shows people from every state, multiple countries, all eating with their hands from communal tables. It was a perfect metaphor. Louisiana's local tradition had become America's shared experience. As the cleanup crews dismantled the pavilions and swept away the shells, nobody could have predicted how thoroughly the exposition had planted seeds. Within 5 years, there would be crawfish festivals in Michigan, seafood boil restaurants in Colorado, and ESPN would be broadcasting the crawfish eating contest as an annual event. Television transformed the crawfish boil from regional curiosity to national obsession, though the journey took longer than most people remember. Justin Wilson had been cooking on PBS since 1971. His broken English and suspenders charming enough, but it wasn't until the late 1980s that mainstream America truly paid attention. What changed? Cable television's explosion meant hundreds of channels desperate for content, and suddenly a Cajun cook saying, "I guarantee," while dumping crawfish into boiling water was programming gold. The Food Network launched in 1993 with a mission to democratize cooking, and Louisiana chefs became their secret weapons. Emeril Lagasse's show debuted in 1995. But here's what the official biographies don't mention. His first attempt at demonstrating a crawfish boil reportedly caused a complete studio evacuation. The ventilation couldn't handle the steam, fire alarms went off, and production had to move outdoors. They filmed subsequent segments outside, inadvertently reinforcing that seafood boils belonged in open air. Paul Prudhomme's influence stretched back further. Remember his K. Paul's restaurant from the late 1970s? By the 1990s, his mail-order seasoning business was reportedly shipping tens of thousands of pounds of crawfish boil mix annually. But Prudhomme did something clever that most food historians miss. He allegedly created different spice levels for different regions. The mix sent to Minnesota was milder than what went to Texas, gradually training American palates to accept more heat. The technological shift nobody discusses is how home video cameras changed everything. Suddenly, families could record their own boils, share techniques across distances, and most importantly, prove to skeptical friends that yes, people really did eat those things. America's Funniest Home Videos aired dozens of clips of first-time crawfish eaters, normalizing the confusion and mess that came with the experience. The barrier wasn't just taste anymore, it was performance anxiety. Some scholars argue that television sanitized the seafood boil tradition, removing its working-class roots and multicultural complexity. They're not entirely wrong. TV shows rarely mention that Vietnamese fishermen supplied most of the crawfish, or that the best seasonings came from Black-owned spice shops, or that the tradition emerged from poverty rather than choice. The televised version was safer, whiter, more middle class than the reality. Here's an unexpected influence: cooking competition shows. When Iron Chef America featured a crawfish battle in 1999, contestants had to incorporate traditional boiling techniques into haute cuisine. Bobby Flay created a deconstructed crawfish boil that food critics mocked, but it introduced the concept to viewers who'd never consider attending an actual boil. Sometimes bastardization is the first step toward appreciation. The QVC shopping network became an unlikely evangelist, reportedly selling tens of thousands of complete crawfish boiling kits during late-night programming in the late 1990s. The kits included pots, burners, seasonings, and instructional videos, everything except the crawfish themselves. They even offered payment plans, democratizing access to what had once required significant upfront investment. Meanwhile, PBS continued its quieter educational mission. Louisiana Cookin' with Chef John Falls provided the scholarly counterweight to cable's entertainment approach. Falls explained the history, the cultural significance, the proper techniques without dumbing them down. His show's transcripts read like anthropology lectures, but somehow he made academic discussions of rude development compelling television. The internet's arrival changed everything again. Food bloggers could suddenly share real-time photos of their boils, debate seasoning ratios in forums, and most crucially, organize local gatherings. Chowhound's message boards from the late 1990s show threads about organizing boils in Seattle, Portland, Boston, places where finding live crawfish had been impossible just years earlier. Digital communities were creating physical gatherings. I find it remarkable that television, a medium designed for passive consumption, somehow inspired active participation in one of America's most hands-on food traditions. Celebrity chefs weren't the only influences. Local news stations across America began featuring Louisiana-style seafood boils as summer entertainment segments. These weren't instructional, they were aspirational, showing happy families gathered around steaming pots. The visual language of the seafood boil, red shells, corn cobs, newspaper-covered tables, became shorthand for authentic community gathering. The economic impact was substantial. Louisiana's crawfish industry grew from regional to national, shipping live product to every major city. FedEx reportedly created specialized shipping protocols, insulated boxes designed specifically for live crawfish, guaranteed overnight delivery anywhere in the continental United States. By 2000, industry estimates suggested Louisiana was shipping millions of pounds of live crawfish annually outside the state. Restaurant chains noticed the trend. Joe's Crab Shack, founded in 1991, built their entire concept around the seafood boil experience, complete with bibs, mallets, and communal seating. They weren't authentic. Locals mocked their seasoning blends and frozen seafood, but they introduced millions to the basic concept. Sometimes approximation paves the way for appreciation of the real thing. The documentary influence deserves mention. Les Blink's 1990 film Yum Yum Yum, a taste of Cajun and Creole cooking, aired on PBS stations nationwide, showing the full context of Louisiana food culture. This wasn't celebrity-driven entertainment. It was intimate observation of actual families preparing actual meals. The film's distribution in libraries and schools meant a generation of students saw seafood boils as cultural practice rather than mere consumption. Publishing added another layer. Community cookbooks from Louisiana churches and social clubs found national distribution through television tie-ins. These weren't professional productions, they were spiral-bound collections of home recipes, authenticated by their amateur status. The River Road Recipes series reportedly sold over 1 million copies, spreading not just recipes, but the entire social context of communal cooking. By the decade's end, something fundamental had shifted. The seafood boil was no longer foreign or exotic. It was familiar, even if most Americans had never attended one. Television had created a shared visual vocabulary, a collective understanding of what a proper boil looked like, even if that understanding was filtered through screens rather than experience. Today's seafood boil barely resembles what Indigenous peoples practiced 2,000 years ago, or what Acadians cobbled together in the 1700s, or even what Depression-era families shared for survival. Walk into any trendy food hall from Brooklyn to Los Angeles, and you'll find someone serving Louisiana-style seafood in plastic bags drenched with garlic butter, filmed for Instagram before anyone takes a bite. The tradition hasn't just spread, it's mutated into something entirely new. The Asian fusion movement transformed everything. Vietnamese Cajun crawfish joints in Houston started adding lemongrass and ginger to traditional boils in the early 2000s. But the rail revolution came when someone, nobody's quite sure who, decided to toss the boiled seafood in sauce after cooking. The Boiling Crab chain, founded by Vietnamese immigrants in 2004, popularized the whole shopping sauce, a mixture of garlic, butter, lemon pepper, and Cajun spices that would horrify traditionalists but captivated millennials. Social media changed how people experience seafood boils more than any highway or television show ever could. The hashtag seafood boil reportedly has millions of posts on Instagram, each one a performance of messiness, abundance, and community. Young people who've never set foot in Louisiana organize boil parties based entirely on YouTube tutorials, ordering seasoning from Amazon, crawfish from online suppliers, creating approximate experiences that somehow still capture the communal essence. Here's what fascinates cultural anthropologists: the plastic bag phenomenon. Traditional boils dump everything on tables, but sometime around 2015, restaurants started serving individual portions in clear bags. It's more sanitary, more portion controlled, completely antithetical to the communal tradition, yet it's become the standard in most cities. The bag itself became part of the experience, shaking it to distribute sauce, the theatrical pour onto your tray, the social media moment. The scholarly argument about authenticity misses the point entirely. Some academics rage against Korean-spiced crawfish or Nashville hot seafood boils, claiming they destroy tradition. Others celebrate the evolution as natural cultural exchange. But watch actual Louisiana natives at these fusion restaurants. They're often the most enthusiastic customers, understanding that tradition isn't preserved through rigid adherence, but through constant reinvention. Food trucks brought another revolution. Suddenly, you could have a seafood boil in a parking lot in Minneapolis or a street fair in Denver, the Cajun Claw in Portland, Pinch Boil House in Las Vegas, Crazy Bugs in Phoenix. Each adapted the tradition to local tastes and regulations. Some use Dungeness crab instead of blue crab. Some add local mushrooms or regional peppers, creating hyper-local variations of a regional tradition. The vegan seafood boil emerged around 2018, using mushrooms, parts of palm, and jackfruit to approximate seafood textures. Purists were apoplectic, but restaurants like the Peeled Tail in Los Angeles reportedly serve hundreds of plant-based crawfish daily to customers who swear it captures the experience, if not the exact flavor. It sounds absurd until you realize the boil was always about more than just seafood. Corporate America fully embraced the trend. Walmart now stocks dozens of varieties of seafood boil seasoning, from traditional Zatarans to Korean-inspired blends. Costco sells frozen boil bags complete with seafood, vegetables, and seasoning packets. Just add water. Even McDonald's allegedly tested a McBoil in Louisiana locations, though it failed spectacularly, proving there are still some limits to commercialization. The pandemic accelerated home boiling in unexpected ways. Restaurants pivoted to boil kits for pickup, complete with instructions, bibs, and Spotify playlists. Zoom boils became a thing. Families connected across distances by simultaneously cooking and eating together online. Louisiana seafood suppliers reported unprecedented increases in small residential orders in 2020. The tradition spreading through isolation rather than gathering. I wonder what those indigenous peoples from Section 1 would think, seeing their shell middens replaced by Instagram posts, their seasonal gatherings becoming year-round commerce, their survival technique becoming entertainment. The economics are substantial. Industry estimates suggest the seafood boil sector, including restaurants, suppliers, and equipment, generates billions annually. Louisiana alone reportedly exports well over 100 million pounds of crawfish yearly, most of it leaving the state. Vietnamese-owned boats harvest the majority. Mexican and Central American workers process it, and it's consumed everywhere from Seoul to Sao Paulo. Cultural controversies erupted regularly. When a London restaurant started serving deconstructed crawfish boils on fine china for $80, Louisiana Twitter exploded. When a Japanese company began farming crawfish in artificial pools, purists claimed it couldn't possibly taste authentic. But the biggest controversy came when reports suggested that much Louisiana crawfish seasoning is now manufactured overseas, globalization coming full circle. The newest trend involves technology. Apps like Boil Buddy help organize gatherings, calculate portions, and locate suppliers. Smart thermometers ensure perfect cooking temperatures, though old-timers insist you should know by sound alone. TikTok tutorials teach peeling techniques to millions, each video spawning dozens of response videos correcting the technique. The tradition has become algorithmic content, infinitely shareable and remixable. Regional variations keep emerging. Detroit adds better-made chips to their boils. Seattle includes geoduck. Miami versions feature Caribbean spices and plantains. Each city claims their version improves on the original, and maybe they're right. Maybe the genius of the seafood boil was always its adaptability, its ability to absorb influences while maintaining its essential character. The environmental impact can't be ignored. Crawfish farming is relatively sustainable, but the carbon footprint of shipping live seafood nationwide is substantial. The mountains of single-use plastic from takeout boils concern environmentalists. Some restaurants now offer sustainable boils with local seafood and compostable packaging, trying to balance tradition with responsibility. As we drift toward tomorrow, the seafood boil continues evolving. Ghost kitchens specializing in boils operate from anonymous warehouses. Artificial intelligence recommends personalized spice blends, and somewhere in Louisiana, families still gather around backyard pots the way they always have. Even as their tradition conquers territories they never imagined. So here we are, at the end of our journey through time and taste, watching a simple act of boiling shellfish transform into something that conquered a continent. The story began with indigenous hands gathering shells along ancient shores, continued through Acadian exile and adaptation, survived slavery and poverty, spread through wars and highways, exploded through television screens, and now lives in millions of variations across the globe. Perhaps what's most remarkable is how this tradition of necessity became a celebration of abundance. How something born from making do transformed into deliberate excess. Those early gatherers couldn't have imagined their survival technique would one day involve overnight shipping, temperature-controlled apps, or arguments about authenticity on social media. Yet somehow, the heart of it remains unchanged. People gathering, sharing, connecting over food that requires no pretense, no formality, just willing hands and patient peeling. As you lie there, letting these stories settle into the quiet corners of your mind, you might notice your breathing has already begun to slow, matching the gentle rhythm of waves that once lapped against those ancient shell middens. The same tidal pull that brought crawfish into shallow waters now draws your consciousness toward deeper rest. Think of all those pots, thousands upon thousands of them, bubbling away across centuries, each one surrounded by different faces, different languages, different circumstances, but all creating the same basic magic: transformation through heat and time, community through shared effort, satisfaction through simple abundance. Let that image drift through your awareness, all those gatherings blending into one eternal moment of human connection. Your body knows what to do now, just as those old cooks knew by sound when the water was ready. You can feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort, each breath releasing a little more of the day's accumulated tension. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing requiring your attention, just this gentle drift towards sleep. Perhaps pull your blanket up a little higher, letting its weight settle across your shoulders, like Spanish moss draping over bayou trees. Everything can wait until tomorrow. Every concern, every task, every thought that isn't soft and slow. Let them all dissolve like salt crystals in warm water, disappearing into something larger, something that doesn't need your conscious attention. The shells have all been peeled now, the tables cleared, the pots cooled and cleaned. All that remains is the memory of gathering, the lingering warmth of spices on fingertips, the satisfied quiet that follows good food shared with others. Even that can fade now, replaced by the deeper satisfaction of approaching sleep. Listen, do you hear it? That gentle bubbling, like water just beginning to simmer. It's your own breathing, regular and calm, carrying you away from waking shores, toward dreams that taste of salt and celebration. Your mind, free to wander wherever it pleases, through time, through memory, through stories half remembered and half invented. Everything is settling now, thoughts growing hazier, edges blurring, the boundary between waking and sleeping becoming as indefinite as the line where bayou meets gulf, where tradition meets innovation, where one day ends and another waits patiently to begin. Rest now, let go, drift into waters warm and welcoming, where all stories eventually lead to quiet, to stillness, to sleep.